Namaste, Padma Shakti with Rasa Yoga. So one really important piece of information is often knowing what not to do. Oftentimes we hear all of the things that we need to do and how we want to approach things, but sometimes we really want to be able to pay attention to what it is that we are not wanting to do. Because one thing that's really great about practicing yoga postures, one of the many great benefits, is that it really is a pattern changer. You know, yoga is a path of transformation, and when you start practicing yoga postures or asanas, you start noticing patterns in your body and certain ways that you might be moving that are not the most beneficial to you. And so what I'd like to do today is that we'll go through a few of the postures, and I'll point out some of the most common patterns or mistakes in people's bodies that are not the most supportive, and maybe we can work on correcting those together. So to start, one of the first most important things to know is that when we're standing, we want our ankles to be really strong and stable. And so we want to avoid our feet rolling in or rolling out. And so to prevent that, by simply spreading our toes, and you could do that right now. If you like to stand up, if you're at home, you just spread your toes, and then you slightly move your heels away from the balls of your feet. That keeps your ankles nice and stable. Now you can practice just relaxing your feet and notice how your ankles, the pattern, what your ankles tend to do. And then notice whenever you spread your toes again that your ankles come into a more stable position. Another thing to notice in standing, very common mistake is people either tend to hyperextend their knees and maybe drop the belly forward, or people will tend to do more of a posterior tilt with the hips pushed forward. What we really want to do is sustain a soft flex, just like a little soft bend in our knees, and we want our pelvis to be in a neutral position. So in a neutral position, sometimes you'll hear us say scoop the tailbone. That's not tucking the tailbone under, but it's understanding that the coccyx or the tailbone is like a little scoop. It's like a little C shape. And when we kind of bring that scoop into a neutral position, it brings the entire pelvis into a neutral position. Another very common mistake in standing is that we drop our ribs down. So you'll notice how the belly can kind of push forward. And what we want to do is you want to take care that your ribs lift up and out of your waist, and that they shift back slightly as you relax your shoulders. We also want to avoid jutting or pushing the chin forward. As we tend to work on computers or drive, quite a bit, we tend to drop our chin, so drop and push forward. So you want to take care that your chin is moving back, just back towards your soft palate or toward the throat. Generally speaking, in the positioning of the head, where your earlobes are, there's a line that moves right down the tops of the shoulders. So another very common mistake from standing is as we go into a forward fold or Uttanasana. Very common mistake is students tend to bend at the waist. And you may notice that in everyday life, you might tend to flex or bend at the waist. The problem with that is it destabilizes the low back, and it puts a lot of force and undue pressure on the low back. And there's no way for that force to be diffused or dispersed, so it tends to really drop right into the low back, and that sometimes is why people will feel a little ache, or sometimes even a little bit more serious, a nerve, maybe a sharper or radiating type pain. But what we want to do is we want to practice instead keeping the ribs shifted back, neutral pelvis, and we generally want to avoid this type of movement at the waist. Instead, from this hip joint, we want to be bending, or we want this fold to happen from this hip joint. One great way of practicing this is that if you stand against a wall and you get about 3 or 4 inches from the wall, you can just take your hands to your hip joints, bend your knees, and go to fold forward. And you want to be able to reach back and feel your sit bones back toward the wall behind you. So we want to take really good care that we're not flexing at our waist, rounding our back, or bending in this way at all. Additionally, when we come into that forward fold and we're hinging or bending from the hips, sometimes you'll hear hinge from the hips, very important to bend your knees. So I'll practice that again. I'll do it with my arms extended. So notice I want to bend my knees to help me get to the floor. We definitely want to avoid kind of rounding our back and hanging to try and touch the floor. We want to take care that we're drawing our ribs up and out of our waist, and we're bending from the hips. Very, very important. Very important for creating strength and stability for not only your hips, but your low back as well. So very important. Another very common issue, or very common problem whenever we're practicing, say, triangle pose, Utthita Trikonasana. So Utthita Trikonasana, triangle pose, is where we're generally standing toward the long edge of the mat. Feet are parallel. Very common mistake here is that we might tend to roll out kind of once again through the ankle. So very important that we keep our toes spread as we sustain this stability through our ankles. Now I'm going to turn my toe out, turn my kind of pivoting on the heel to turn foot out. Very common mistake or a common issue here is more flexing from the waist. We want to avoid, even in a lateral movement, we want to avoid flexion from the waist. Instead, we want to sustain that same principle, drawing back toward low belly, heart lifted, chin draws back, and we want to hinge from the hip. And we do not have to work to try and make ourselves get down to the floor. So Utthita Trikonasana, we're moving up as we move to the side, and as we come back up, we're leaning into our spine really, really strongly. We're drawing the thigh bone into the pelvic area, the acetabulum, and we want to hinge from the hip. We want to avoid flexion from the waist. Now, from this position in triangle, I'm going to lower my top arm, looking down at my hand. I want to take care that there's not a lot of weight dropping into this hand. I'm really strong through the waist. You're leaning into your spine. You stay very, very strong through the length of your spine, and you avoid flexion from the waist. Another very common problem is reaching for the ground. Students will sometimes reach and round, so we want to avoid that. And the next common problem is pushing chin out and trying to look up. Instead, particularly if you're new to practice, when you're in class, just continue looking forward. So it's very important that we remember that as we're practicing postures, that we want to learn to utilize our joints. It's understanding our ankles. Our ankles are rotating, our toes flex and extend, right? From our knees, flex, extend. Our hips, there's a rotation from and also a flexion and extension from our shoulders. And so we want to take care that we're really using our body mechanically in the way that it's meant to be used. So one really important thing is that you want to avoid, generally speaking, putting force directly into any of the joints. One great way to help prevent that is we keep the joints slightly flexed. So another very common issue, particularly around shoulders and with our elbows, and most especially wrists, is when we practice downward facing dog, Adho Mukha Svanasana. So one very common issue, one very common problem in downward facing dog, I'm going to start from all fours. One very common issue or problem is that particularly students new to the practice of yoga will turn their toes under and lift and press up and then try to push back. So what happens is then all the force is then on the wrist and really the wrist and the heel of the hand. And we really want to avoid that. So it's very important that as we're coming up, we want to have the fingers are spread. We want to feel that sense of the knuckles in contact with the ground. Your elbows are slightly flexed. As we lift, instead of coming straight up, we want to practice pulling back from our low belly. It's like our hips are drawing us back. Another common issue is hyperextension of the elbows. Just keep the elbows slightly flexed as you press back. Your pelvis stays in a neutral position as you make your way into downward facing dog. Downward facing dog is terrific for building strength and stability in the shoulders and in the upper back when it's done properly. So a really important practice is remembering basically when you're going into downward dog from all fours, you're moving back and then up, not straight up and then trying to push back. We want to get the force out of the joints. So another really common problem in the practice of yoga, and when we're practicing yoga postures, is what happens with the eyes. Oftentimes, for example, particularly when we're practicing a posture, say Vrikshasana, or tree pose. For Vrikshasana or tree pose, which is a stability posture, we shift our weight and then we take one foot up. We may take it to the ankle, to the calf, or we may take it to the inner thigh. And one very common problem in this practice is that people have a pattern of trying to find balance by looking down. It's quite difficult for me because I'm so practiced at keeping gaze lifted. So we want to take care that we avoid using the floor as our reference point for anything. We want to practice keeping our gaze uplifted. Very, very important. Remember, yoga is here to reveal patterns to you so that you can make adjustments. And one of the most common patterns in humankind is living life as though we're moving in a downward spiral. Yoga is a science and technology that can get you on that upward spiral. Part of that upward spiral is learning to build from the ground up, allowing that to lead to an upward gaze. So even as I'm practicing a balancing posture, my gaze is lifted. Now finally, one really common pattern, unfortunately, that we see in people in practice is a frown on the face. One of the most important things that can lead us into that upward spiral, that can lead us into that place of mastery of the nervous system, of truly being able to feel a deeper sense of self-acceptance and mercy, is the facial expressions that we hold in our face. So not only do you want to keep your gaze uplifted, but let the corners of your mouth turn upward as well. See yourself as you truly are, compassionate, divine, and a beautiful being. So turn the corners of your mouth up, and if it breaks out into a really big smile, just let it shine. You're a radiant and a beautiful being, and I thank you for your time today. I hope to see you in class or broadcasting in for classes. Namaste. How long was that one?
14.
Oh, wow.